part of Putin's legitimacy is being able to say that I pulled us out of that. I jailed the oligarchs, I stabilized the economy. And if you're getting to a situation where there is serious instability in the ruble and devaluation, there are enormous, say, political impacts, both on terms of his legitimacy and on his ability to describe the war as something distant. And China has, of course, grown far closer to Russia and is effectively underwriting the aggression in Ukraine through its aid and other support and trade. China is forever talking about multipolar world and recreating the international order, even though, of course, they've benefited substantially from the old or the existing order, which they're now seeking to undermine. They will grasp at any opportunity to do that. And in the run-up to the Brics meeting, there was much talk emanating from Beijing about expanding the group, about using it more effectively as a counterweight against the West. I can't see that, because I don't think that the Brics group is sufficiently coherent.
So China's economic figures were released last week, but one glaring omission was their unemployment figures for youth. Why wouldn't they release these figures? This is worryingly wider than sort of optimizing surveys, as China puts it, isn't it?
Yeah, because they're bad. I mean, China has this tendency that if something is unpalatable, you just don't, you suppress it. We see this countlessly with Chinese data. You've got to be very cautious about Chinese statistics anyway, because a lot of them are somewhat wide of what we understand to be real statistics. But they do have a tendency, if something's bad, you suppress it or you don't publish it. And I think the decision not to publish youth unemployment figures is a testament of just how bad they're getting and how embarrassing it is for the party and how challenging it is to try and rectify that.
So for many countries, this kind of 5% growth target would just be unimaginable. Why is it such a worry for China that they now seem to think they may be unlikely to hit that?
Well, they had set themselves ambitious targets in their 5-year plans. And for them to consistently revise down the growth figure is an embarrassment for them. And it is, to some extent, an admission of failure. 5% by international standards would be regarded as pretty good. By Chinese standards, it's pretty mediocre. And there are those who would say that even that is an exaggeration, that if you look at many other economic indicators, and analysts based in Shanghai and Beijing have become experts at looking at everything from freight to nighttime shots of Shanghai to see where the lights are coming on, to try and find proxies for economic activity, because they don't really trust the figures that come out of China, because there's a lot of pressure on local authorities to fulfill the plan. So 5% by Chinese standards is poor, but even that I think we have to be a little bit skeptical about.
So there was once this idea that China could become a sort of leading world economy at quite a rapid rate. What do these figures and the latest results mean for that target, do you think?
Well, it's going to be much harder. I think the key target was, will they surpass the United States as the world's biggest economy? I mean, they are by some measures already, but in terms of the prominent figure, there's been much talk about, will they become the world's biggest economy by 2030? And I think this suggests that may never happen, that the combination of all the economic challenges that China's now facing will mean at best years of stagnation, if not falling growth, if not a crash. And so I think this vision, which has been a central part of Chinese propaganda, that they will overhaul the United States and become the world's leading and most powerful economy, may be receding into the distant future, if indeed it happens at all.
And you mentioned they've got a multitude of economic things to deal with. How does the Chinese housing market play into this?
The housing market is huge in a number of ways. I mean, it's a bubble. It's a classic bubble. I mean, this is a Ponzi scheme, a massive Ponzi scheme. The property sector accounts for something like about a quarter to a third of economic activity in China. You've seen 3 decades of rapidly rising prices, frenzy of construction, building vast cities across China, many of them which remain empty. The figures are hard to come by, accurate ones, but estimates are between 50 and 100 million empty homes across China, and that's enough to house the British population, one each, and still leave some. This was bound to come to grief at some point, simply because you couldn't sustain that sort of perpetual price rises, and such a large proportion of it was being bought for investment, for speculation, rather than to actually live in. And now, of course, we're seeing the bursting of that bubble. And because property is such a big part of the Chinese economy, it's having an incredible spillover effect on the banks, on local governments, and much further. So the potential of the property crisis to badly damage the Chinese economy and the international economy is huge.
And what was the impact of COVID on China's economy sort of more severe than first expected?
It was severe. The impact of COVID, yes, but more the impact of China's attempt to eradicate, this fanatical attempt to eradicate COVID completely from China. Zero COVID, it became known as. Very closely associated with Xi Jinping, stubbornly sticking to this, even while the rest of the world was opening up. That created incredible economic problems, a big slowdown in China. It crippled economic activity with borders closed, with internal lockdowns, restrictions on movement. And initially, when China abruptly lifted those controls at the end of last year, the belief was that economic activity would bounce back, which it did to some extent, but now it's petering out. And the impact of that reopening, I think we've seen it. And from everything from falling exports, youth unemployment, the bursting of the property bubble, suddenly all this, what we're hearing about, massive hidden debt in the system, enormous amounts of money involved. They're suddenly facing all these problems. And it's not just about property. It's not just about youth unemployment. This is about an economic model which has driven the Chinese economy for 40 years, which has run out of steam, which is unsustainable, which can't go on. And it doesn't appear that there's any alternative. They talk the talk about innovation, about consumer-driven economy, but there's little sign that the party has the ability to deliver that for several reasons, one of which is innovation requires a good deal more freedom of thought and activity. Consumerism requires somewhat more decentralization. It requires allowing people to think more, to do more. And when the party wants to be in every classroom, in every laboratory, in every boardroom, and the priority is control and security, it makes it very difficult to shift this economic model. And it's an economic model which has been built on a lack of transparency, wasteful investment. In many ways, the property sector is a microcosm of the wider economy. And although there are smarter policymakers in Beijing that recognize it's just not sustainable, the question is the party capable of making the changes which are necessary? And it certainly doesn't look that way.
We know China's got significant foreign investments abroad, not least in their Belt and Road project. Can you briefly explain the Belt and Road and how might it be affected by this?
Well, the Belt and Road is a curious beast. I mean, it's very hard to pin down at times. It started out as the new Silk Roads. It was described at the land Silk Road, the sea Silk Road, the digital Silk Road, the Arctic Silk Road. Then it was all brought together under this clunky term, Belt and Road. I think the best way of understanding it is it's become an umbrella term for just about everything China does internationally. And the focus sometimes, I think mistakenly, is on the economic side of it, because they are throwing billions and billions of dollars, especially at emerging economies. But I think the better way of looking at it is an instrument of Chinese influence and power. Its attempt to sort of reshape the world in its own fashion, in its own image, and its attempt to push its own influence well beyond its borders through debt trap diplomacy. It's been described, countries that run up such enormous debts because it's apparently free money, which it isn't. And then, of course, you're required to support China in numerous ways as a price of that money. Countries find themselves in enormous debt difficulty, and China is not an easy creditor to deal with, and has not been particularly understanding in terms of dealing with this. And in some cases, it has taken possession of facilities, including ports, in lieu of unpaid debts. So I think that the BRI is primarily a political and a strategic instrument of Chinese policy internationally. But it is running into problems because the debts are now so huge. And of course, there's two ways of looking at debts. It's a problem for the people that borrow, but it's also a big problem for the people that lend the money. And at a time when China's facing a lot of economic headwinds at home, internationally, a lot of these arrangements are going pear-shaped as well. I mean, China feels more comfortable in dealing with kleptocrats and tyrants. They're on the same wavelength than they do in dealing with other democratic countries. But unfortunately, when you're dealing with corrupt systems who will take your money, they're not always very good at paying it back. So they've tried to reinvent the BRI, calling it all sorts of other things to extend their influence. But they don't talk about Belt and Road as openly or as often as they used to. It's become a kind of, not quite a dirty word, but it's not as much spoken about because of the difficulties it's been facing. So this is another of multiple headwinds the Communist Party is facing at the moment.
And as you say, there's been a sort of increasing resistance to China's activities on the world stage from the US and the West, especially in the Pacific. Has this had an impact there, or have they managed to keep these two issues separate?
Well, I think that a lot of countries in the Pacific, it depends where you are. I think countries like South Korea and Japan have really become much closer to the US and to the West as a result of China's pushiness internationally. China's very quick to accuse countries of having a Cold War mentality, whatever that means. I mean, you could argue that you actually need one in dealing with China at the moment. But in terms of the pushback against China, this is very much a product of the Communist Party's own behavior internationally. In fact, until very recently, the West facilitated China's rise. And engagement was very much a policy which went well beyond its sell-by date. And it's only more recently, as a result of China's behavior, that we're seeing more pushback and more talk about containment. Japan is a prime example of where they have responded to increased Chinese aggression by becoming much more forthright and outspoken about their own security, linking it to that of Taiwan, closer to the States. An amazing rapprochement with South Korea, because don't forget, Japan and South Korea have been not on comfortable terms, shall we say, over the years. For other parts of the Pacific, other parts of Asia, there's been a desire not to pick sides, that to kind of, they're all very dependent on China economically. A lot of them are dependent on the States for their security. But even there, you're seeing countries recognizing that this attempt to straddle the relationship is becoming more and more difficult. The Philippines is a very good example of that. Again, it's largely because of China, Communist Party pushiness in the South China Sea, that the Philippines has once again turned back to the States after apparently being more accommodating to China. So it is a complicated international system, but I think overall, it is remarkable how weak China's soft power is. Multiple surveys show that they are not much respected. that people have a low opinion of Beijing, in spite of all the money that they've spent. I mean, that's not money well spent if you look at the result in terms of the soft power you've created.
And we saw it was only 8 years ago that the British government under David Cameron and George Osborne announced this golden era of trade with China. But they wanted in on that big growth that we saw in the early 2000s. What's changed?
Well, arguably not enough. I think that it's an embarrassing thing to even consider these days, just how far Britain went to kowtow to Beijing under Osborne and Cameron. And if you look at some of the results that came out of that era, the China involvement in the British nuclear industry, I mean, hello, how on earth was that allowed? But of course it was at the time, and they're still trying to get them out of it. And this triggered a whole era, not only among businesses, in academia as well, where the only due diligence on Chinese money, it seemed, was the number of zeros on the check. And it more recently, of course, the atmosphere has changed remarkably. But arguably, Communist Party linked entities are so entrenched in sensitive parts of the British economy, industries, academia, for students, for research. They are so dependent upon Chinese money that it's become much more difficult to disengage or de-risk, as the new buzz term. So yes, a lot has changed rhetorically, but I think we're still in some respects struggling because of these dependencies that were created during the Cameron Osborne era. And I think academia is a perfect example of this. I mean, the Communist Party thrive off the greed and the naivety and the gullibility, of which there are bucketfuls in academia. And there's a certain defensiveness there because they regard any questioning of where their money comes from, how it's spent, how their innovations are applied, as somehow a gross intrusion on academic freedom. There's not, in terms of transparency, certain corners of British academia are pretty much on par with the Chinese Communist Party. So things have changed. There's a different conversation now. People have woken up to the reality of the Chinese Communist Party, an organization that doesn't hesitate to use coercion in trade, investment, in market access. But I think we're still somewhat stuck as to how to deal with that and what that means in policy. And we're still trying to have it each way. Let's engage on economic and trade, but let's be critical on human rights and security. And I'm not sure that you can make those distinctions with China.
But is there a line to be tread here? If China is kind of pushed away, if the West cuts more of these economic ties, that it'll just push China into the arms of alternative states and blocs and ideas like Brics or Russia?
To some extent, yes. There is a certain amount of calibration necessary. How far do you push the policy of de-risking, which of course is a new buzzword? Decoupling has kind of been pushed to one side. De-risking sounds a bit more practical and sensible. But it is a question how far you push it, because China is the world's second biggest economy. China trade is important. And you're not talking about cutting it off completely. You're talking about being very cautious when it comes to creating dependencies, especially in strategic areas. And you're talking about being very aware of the way China uses these relationships for leverage, for coercion. But it is a fine line, and it is a difficult one, which I think countries, not the US is at the forefront of these moves, but also across Europe, where I don't think there's a country which is not reassessing its relationship with China.
So we mentioned the Brics nations there, including Russia and China. They're currently meeting in Johannesburg, South Africa. Do you think Russia's position in that bloc has changed because of their economic troubles?
It has, in that I think that Russia will certainly be seen as something of a drag on it. And I think politically it's something of an embarrassment. The Brics, I've always been slightly skeptical about the strength as a sort of coherent group, because they are very different. The Russian aggression against Ukraine has complicated matters. South Africa has been worryingly supportive of Russia, although that's not a position which is widely supported within South African society. India has been ambiguous because of its long-standing historic links to Russia and has been willing to take economic advantage of Moscow's predicament. China has, of course, grown far closer to Russia and is effectively underwriting the aggression in Ukraine through its aid and other support and trade. So it's a complicated picture. It would be intriguing to know what's been going on behind closed doors in Johannesburg, because I think there are a lot of areas where they would prefer to fudge it at the moment.
During this meeting, are China going to be seeking to shore up their economy a little bit on the world stage, do you think?
Yes, I think China would like to turn the BRICS into a bigger, an expanded organization, which is a more effective foil to the Western industrialized nations, particularly to the G7, which is, of course, a powerful group of advanced Western economies. China is forever talking about multipolar world and recreating the international order, even though, of course, they've benefited substantially from the old or the existing order, which they're now seeking to undermine. They will grasp at any opportunity to do that. And in the run-up to the BRICS meeting, there was much talk emanating from Beijing about expanding the group, about using it more effectively as a counterweight against the West. I can't see that, because I don't think that the BRICS group is sufficiently coherent. I don't think India would go along with that. I think it's bad timing from the Chinese perspective, because they've got so many economic difficulties at home, and it won't have gone down well that they were supposed to have an economic forum yesterday in Johannesburg, an economic forum to discuss their cooperation going forward. This was an extremely important event, and Xi Jinping was going to talk himself at that event. The event went ahead. He never turned up. The speech was read by the commerce minister. No explanation. I mean, not that we would expect one, because this is China. The foreign minister disappeared 2 months ago. But it's got a lot of tongues wagging. What is the significance of this? Where is Xi? Why didn't he turn up to a meeting which arguably was the most central meeting to this new vision of where he wants to take the BRICS? And I think to me, it says that he has enormous difficulties at home. I'd be cautious about reading too much politically into that, but certainly economically. And it does underline, I think, the difficulties they're going to face in turning the BRICS into an effective alternative forum to Western industrialized nations. I don't think the appetite is there. Xi's preoccupied. Russia certainly is. India's got no great stomach for it.
How have other nations, BRICS included, reacted to this kind of beefing up or attempt to beef up the BRICS union? We've heard of the UAE, for example, buying cheaper Russian oil, and then reselling it at marked up prices. Do we think that nations will try and join BRICS, or are they going to try and sort of play this for their own ends?
I think they will play it for their own ends. I just don't think they have the coherence to... There was talk very recently, I think it was floated again from Beijing, of a common currency, probably the renminbi, to drive trade within BRICS. I mean, that's not going to happen. You're talking about a very proud set of nations who are really in this for their own interests. And I think that they will talk the talk. They will express a desire to see more unity, to see more cooperation, to see this sort of multipolar world, whatever that means. And you'll see the cliches rolled out. But I think that I would be doubtful that that is turned into very much that you might regard as concrete action. I mean, there will be other countries, UAE certainly, who would want to sort of nibble around the edges and would see this as an opportunity of doing more trade with these big nations. But whether this means profound change, I doubt that.
So it doesn't seem likely then that the war in Ukraine and this almost shift to an extent on the world stage has drawn many nations towards the idea of the Brics and the multipolar world?
No, in some respects, it might have made it more toxic, having the Russian presence there. I think a lot of countries have been more than happy to gain economic advantage from the Russia-Ukraine war, particularly in picking up some of the dropped-off trade where Russia's been keen to get its raw materials, its oil, out to alternative markets, and has been willing to discount quite substantially to do that. I think there's a lot of nations prepared to take advantage of Russia's economic difficulties to strike good deals with them. But Russia's toxic. I mean, Putin's not at the summit. South Africa tried to get an exemption, tried to say, well, it'd be a bit embarrassing if he came along, and there's no way we can arrest him, surely. And because, of course, Putin is wanted under international law for alleged war crimes. And in the end, he decided not to go. And to me, that speaks volumes. Russia is toxic, and as much as countries might want to take advantage of trade with Russia at this point, I think they'd be very cautious of cozying up too much more close to Putin.
And you mentioned Russia's economic troubles. The ruble has got to 100 rubles to the dollar last week. There's certainly a psychological impact to that number, but is this really a significant moment for Russia?
It does seem to be a turning point. Russia has weathered sanctions pretty well. I mean, it's found alternative markets for a lot of its goods, China, India, elsewhere. It's also been able to avoid some of the severe pain from sanctions by importing from elsewhere. A lot of it smuggled through Central Asia, a lot of it smuggled from elsewhere. But I think there's only so long you can put that off. And I think, to me, the decline in the ruble suggests that the strain on the budget of financing the war, as well as the need to bring in more and more and expensive imports from alternative markets, is starting to tell. And I would say there's two broad political aspects to this, which in some respects are more significant or as significant as economic. One is that Putin has always maintained or tried hard to cushion the Russian population from the impact of the war by saying this is a special military operation. I mean, that's farcical. I think even the Russians now recognize that. But as long as he was able to shield the population from too severe an economic downturn, he was always able to maintain this fiction that somehow the war's out there. Now, drones coming into Moscow suggests it isn't, of course, but the ruble wobbling also sends a message to the Russian people. Now, I recall being in Russia in the early 90s, the incredible impact of the economic crisis, the collapse of the ruble, which was worth next to nothing after a period. This had an enormous psychological impact back then on the Russian people, and probably paved the way for the emergence of Putin to power. And arguably, this is incredibly, we're not seeing that scale of collapse in the ruble, but if the ruble started to severely devalue, and this started to recreate memories of those painful times in the early 90s. And part of Putin's legitimacy is being able to say that I pulled us out of that. I jailed the oligarchs, I stabilized the economy. And if you're getting to a situation where there is serious instability in the ruble and devaluation, there are enormous, say, political impacts, both on terms of his legitimacy and on his ability to describe the war as something distant and a special military operation which is not impacting at home.
So voices from the Kremlin sort of rush to blame this on soft monetary policy. Is this true? And do you think this rate rise up to 12% is going to dig them out of this?
It's the central bank is quite well respected internationally in Russia. They've tended to manage things reasonably well. I don't think the Kremlin's got a clue about economics. And it's an easy thing to blame the central bank for overly tightening monetary policy. But what's the alternative? Because it was only after they'd hiked interest rates that the ruble was stabilized. And what are they wanting? To cut interest rates would send the ruble into freefall, which would require capital controls or more severe controls on the economy, which again would bring home to the Russian people the extent of the crisis that they're facing, which is really what the Kremlin doesn't want to do. So I think the central bank is a useful bogeyman. You can blame it for over tightening of the economy, but I don't think in the circumstances what else they were able to do. And there are a lot of economists internationally who have quite a high respect for the managers, the technocrats at the Russian central bank. And as I say, a view that really the Kremlin hasn't got a clue.
So sanctions on trade were already in place, but what sort of impact can a devalued ruble on the world stage actually have at home?
It just makes imports much more expensive for them. And a lot of the substitution, a lot of the imports are now coming from, say, Central Asia. A lot of those are diverted imports. For instance, the trade between some of the stands, Central Asian countries, with Europe, with Germany, has increased suspiciously fast. And the understanding is that they are probably being rerouted to Russia. Trade with China, of course, is booming, but China doesn't want rubles. What's it going to do with rubles? That trade is in renminbi. It sees that as a way of forcing a greater internationalization of the renminbi. So I think that the fall in value of the ruble has a very big impact on trade, on imports in particular. I mean, the exports of raw materials, oil tends to be priced in dollars. But on imports, it certainly has a significant impact and a knock-on effect because of the routing of Russia's imports now, the importance of China, the importance of Central Asia.
And is that going to have an impact for kind of the everyday people of Russia? Is that going to affect any of their incomes or things they're buying?
It will push up prices because it'll become more expensive to import stuff. Prices have already been rising. Inflation is quite high now in Russia. Again, echoes of the early 90s, although we're not seeing anything like the sort of levels that we saw back then. And the nature of what's in the shops has changed as well, because you're no longer seeing luxury items from the West because of sanctions. If they're coming in from circuitous routes at a great deal more expense. But mostly you're now seeing stuff which is coming in from China, from India to some extent, from the Middle East. They will have noticed the difference in terms of what they can buy and they're able to buy. And you added to that is the increase in cost, the increase in price that will come from the devaluation of the ruble.
And many of Putin's core supporters are oligarchs. They're trading internationally in resources. How is the devaluation of the ruble going to affect them? Are they going to be quite unsettled by this?
It will badly affect their business, but then again, their businesses have been pretty badly affected anyway. They've been sanctioned internationally. They are, in many cases, seeing their businesses crippled as a result of that. They don't like the war, a lot of them, but few of them would publicly go out and say that because it's a very dangerous thing to do. But clearly, this would put more pressure on the oligarchs, on the big businesses who are already suffering badly because of the war and because of the sanctions. And there are some brave Russian business people who have spoken out only in the last couple of weeks. And this would hopefully put more pressure on some of those to be a little bit more forthright and to voice their opposition to the war, although that is a dangerous thing in Russia.
In a way, then, could this actually help Russia in the war? There's a lower value of the ruble might mean exports go up, means more money to send in that they can then channel into resources for the war. Could it have that sort of impact?
I think that the Russian coffers really depend upon oil, gas, raw materials, which tend to be priced in dollars anyway. So I think that the most important figure for the Russian economy is the movement in oil prices or other raw material prices, which have seen a little bit of a bounce over the last week or two. That ultimately will influence the amount of money they have to spend and to finance the war, because of course at the end of the day it is the cost of the war, it's the cost of financing this operation, which is the biggest drain on the Russian exchequer, and which is the biggest reason for the fall in the ruble.
Where does Russia go from here, do you think?
It's hard because I think that this is indicative of the cost coming home, of the fact that the price of the war is now hitting the ruble, that it wasn't quick, it wasn't a special military operation, it looks like it's going to drag on for much, much longer. You would hope that it would strengthen the arm of those who would say, look, we need to come to some accommodation, we need to look more closely at this. But of course, the only voice that really matters is Vladimir Putin and those people who are close to him at the Kremlin.
Ian Williams, thank you very much.